think the insights they've shared today really make a powerful statement about the importance of making change to the research communication practices and ultimately helping us all advance the science, because that's what it's all about. That's what this organization is all about. So I'd like to begin to engage the panel with some questions and answers from the audience, and start this by asking the panel just to give us some of their takeaways from the other lectures that we heard today. And I'll start to give you an example. So Brian Nosek said, show and share. We learned that in kindergarten. And you all push my buttons, right? But Brian said, show and share. It's a principle, and if we understand that and practice that, it helps us think about what the importance to advancing science through sharing it, right? So I happen to be married to one of the world's greatest kindergarten teachers, so I get a tutorial on this every year. So Ashley, how about you?
I would say that one of my takeaways was, so we know what our goals are. We want to be open. We want to share kind of the entire process of science. We know that sharing the underlying data and data involved is very important. And that's great that we have the common goal, and then it's getting there where we have a couple areas of opportunity. We know that no matter if we want to have articles or information be freely available, it still costs somehow. There's still a cost associated somewhere. So how do we build those business models? How do we sustain whatever models we choose? And so kind of combining all the different components that we have here to make an actual open science kind of discipline scalable.
Nick?
There you go.
I think one of the things that I was certainly reminded of during Dan's presentation and others is sort of the important role that community plays in open. I know Dan referenced sort of the importance of community and sort of launching and sustaining open source initiatives, and I think that carries over to the open research, sort of open research as well, sort of creating and promoting sort of the process by which you make your data openly available, your articles. That's best done by having a community of people that are sort of bought into this vision and are sharing that and growing the community. And I think that's the way we scale too. There's so much sort of awareness raising and sort of change in both policies and practices that needs to happen to sort of make open the default in a meaningful way. And I think community is really the way to get there that actually scales to meet sort of the challenge that we have in front of us.
Nick, I have to say you particularly pushed my buttons, right? When he, you've all heard the expression like off the charts, the data point off the charts. Did you happen to notice the pricing chart with it's 500 some number? I couldn't quite read that. And so, something important to say that I think is not particularly well known, in the strategy that we've deployed is that. Since 2014, since we initiated this, we've frozen our subscription prices and will continue to do so through 2018 for exactly the reason that Nick was pointing out, how this price has become such an obstacle. And we don't know how long we can do that. We've made a commitment to keep the price low, and we've been able to do that. That price freeze for 5 years now. What we'd like to be able to do is hold that price down until we can free it completely. But I thank Nick for pointing out that as a particularly difficult obstacle. Dina.
So my answer is relatively short, but I think one thing that's really important, or at least what's been brought home to me, is that it's very important for the community to know what resources are available in order to support and foster open science. There's, so many repositories and journals that support it, but where do people go? How do they find everything? And especially for communities that maybe aren't used to sharing data, are there some case studies or some information that could be shared with them to foster that culture change?
Thank you. Dan?
So I'm going to refer to the prices of journals again, and since I am involved in an interdisciplinary science organization, I was not surprised to see chemistry as the top, because I think when you look at supply, demand, market elasticity, they value the traditional model of publishing as much or any of the fields that I see. So I bet that there would be a correlation between the prices of those journals and how much the culture of the organizations that they underpin value journals as the thing, impact factor, highest impact factor, highest visibility. And ECS, we have chemistry in our name, that is a big part of our culture and community.
Thanks, Meredith.
So I think one of my key takeaways around Free the Science, and particularly in my case, open data, is culture change and the need and importance of communicating your goal and your outputs. We've all done, we've all sort of tried to do that in our panel, individually with our talks. And, these issues and things around, for instance, in Dryad's case of making data open, we can get bogged down in the technical challenges so often, but these are social issues. They're social challenges. They're not overly technical challenges. We can get bogged down in how does the workflow work? It's not going to work for me, or this data set, you can't upload this particular data set or whatever. But what we need is engagement. We need to recognize these are human and social issues that are around culture change, that we need policy, we need guidance, we need to communicate, and we need strategies.
And Brian.
It's notable to me in these kinds of sessions how much alignment there is. Everybody is pushing the same direction. And the challenge, of course, is coordinating and communicating that. But then also the idea of open science compared to where we are now feels very distant and daunting. And so the real key, I think, in any successful cultural change movement is getting started. It's just taking incremental steps that accumulate into transformation in the long term. And so that's what I've been particularly pleased with the work that ECS has been doing, is setting a goal and then initiating steps to get to that goal in a very clear-eyed way. And so that, I think, was evident in these.
Good, thank you. And I would like to start the questions off, so I'll lead off. The first one being about some of the barriers that some of the panel began to talk about. So one of the biggest is that tenure, promotion, and remuneration, which is often linked to journal impact factor. How is the system going to change to embrace open access, where journal impact factor doesn't matter as much, and there are non-traditional scholarly publishing objects like data sets? Anyone want to tackle that one? Dan.
So I'll start by just saying there are existence proofs in younger fields than maybe we're in. We're a 115-year-old society, that different measures can be important in promotion and tenure and those things. I was on P&T probably 15 years ago at our university, and the chair of computer science was explaining to us how important it was that this particular professor had been voted on the dream team of the SIGGRAPH conference 5 years in a row. So this was a peer-based evaluation process that said, who at SIGGRAPH, who's presenting, SIGGRAPH is a computer graphics thing, would you want on your dream team for a graphics thing? And this was meaningful to them and their community because they saw it as connected to impact. And so there are existence proofs. Likewise, so CS at our university and most places around the country was nascent in the late 60s, early 70s. So it's a newer field. They're looking for other kinds of measures of impact. Likewise, at our university, bioengineering is fairly new. It was in the 60s when it was founded. And for them, commercialization of technologies, getting medical devices out in the field, getting things into the clinic matters as much as a measure of impact. And so those things can get people promoted. And so I think that there are existence proofs of other metrics than the paradigm of publish or perish. But we have to have transitional resources so that people can make it there.
I think from a funder's perspective, that funders will also play an important part of this culture shift, and I hope this is something that we talk about in the Open Research Funders Group, is that as we start to really acknowledge and support people and researchers with open practices, that'll get the attention of institutions as well to see that if the funding comes when there's more of an open practice, that'll trickle down kind of to the tenure and promotion.
Yeah, I think that's a great point in that all of the different stakeholders that have levers have an influence on that process. Institutions also have a very clear responsibility in this. One, in that the policies or practices for promotion and tenure often aren't transparent themselves. And so it is left to researchers to anticipate what is it that I need to do, and all of the signals say volume, just keep producing. Even if that's not really what the promotion committee would want. But a lot of times it is what the promotion committee would want, and that signal is sometimes sent explicitly and sometimes implicitly. Just as a quick example, I went up for full professor 3 summers ago, and the admin said, okay, now it's time to print out all of your articles and give them to me to share with the committee. And I said, all of my articles? I have 100 articles. What are you going to do with them? Weigh them? Like, this is ridiculous, right? No one is going to read all of those articles. So the implicit message there is numbers is what counts. Just send a lot, right? What they could have said, and they could have told me once I was tenured, sort of this is how you prepare to get to full professor, is at the time you're going to give us 3 articles. Whichever ones you want, but it's going to be 3. And the committee is really actually going to read them, and they're going to evaluate the quality of that work and ask the external reviewers to read those 3 and evaluate the quality. So great, we'd love that you do more stuff, but at least have 3 big ones. That would completely change the incentive mindset for me in how it is I structure the work that I did trying to get advanced. And so some institutions are doing things like that. But it needs to be surfaced, what are the standards and practices across institutions, and it needs to be explicitly aligned with what we want researchers to be spending their time doing.
So are there any follow-up questions from the audience on the impact factor issue? Any other questions at all? I have one from the live stream. Fernando.
The first one is recognition. Many times you'll perform a study and it's only later after an initial publication or 2 that you go back and you look at your own data and you say there's something else in there. And I could see the situation, for example, in the race to discover the structure of DNA, where if Rosalind Franklin had published her first studies where they actually labeled the molecules, and Pauling's group looked at it and said, aha, I've got the structure there. Who would have gotten credit? And that's an important factor, which I think may be an impediment towards publishing data until it's been thoroughly mined. And it might then cause some researchers to say, well, if I've got to publish all my data, I'm not going to publish so quickly, which might not necessarily hurt our fields, but it would have an impact. And then related to that is the intellectual property issues. It does make intellectual property a bit more complicated. Many research institutes and universities have gone to a model that generating intellectual property is as important as publications. And there could be some a conflict between the open science publication and your ability to patent later the technologies or the processes which you're inventing. Thanks.
Any panelists have some thoughts on that?
I can take comments on some in terms of concerns about publishing your data and then later on finding some information that maybe you might miss out on in terms of research. In one example of a data set that we had in Dryad is actually linked out to scientific data, which is a data paper that Dan mentioned. And so this was a really interesting project where it was a massive group of citizen science project that was a collection of images from the Serengeti collected over a period of time, a couple of years. And it was the largest group of different images, and it was an identifying project where citizen scientists were helping to identify the animals in the pictures. And there were some really rare species that were captured. And then what happened was the group that was working on this project, the main driver was actually this one involved in the collection in citizen science. That was her main focus. So she deposited this data as a data paper in Scientific Data to get it out there and to get it out there very, very quickly. And the reason why she did is because she was collaborating with a variety of different researchers in other fields, and she knew other papers were coming out, and she didn't want to hold up that work. So she put that big data set out, and then there are data papers and articles coming out on behavior, on how some animals would show up in locations at the same time that were generally competing for the same food, and what did that mean in, I think it was like an animal relationship, some animal behavioral field. So that was something that they saw. They also saw papers come out quickly about machine learning and artificial intelligence. The idea was to try to do a better job of identifying the animals than the actual citizen scientists did. The citizens identified the animals correctly like 96% of the time, so they've got this information, and the AI wanted to improve it. And then further studies came out, and they started to use this data set for education purposes. And then later, they talked in the standards in an AI field, talking about what are the standards for actually publishing data, and what are the standards for our community, what kind of metadata do we need, what kind of documentation do we need, and so forth. So although there can be challenges in terms of sort of worries about my data set and whether I'll miss out on research coming out of it, I'd like to suggest that there's actually so many benefits in addition that it can be done planned and actually accelerate it. And the original researcher who did the certification, or did the collection, the citizen science project, was cited in every single one of those cases after that.
Thank you. Are there others?
I'm just going to add one small thing, and that is that I think we should be shooting for the 99.99% probable thing versus the potential 0.0001% that a Nobel Prize is buried in there. And to reiterate this point is that we are trying to go faster, have more impact sooner, and if your data set is foundational to something, the unlikely 0.001% thing, you'll get recognition and cited as the foundational data for it. But the whole field can move forward in the way that Meredith was just saying. When the data's out there and you're running with it and a community of people are looking at it, finding new ways to analyze it. And I think as a community, we're likely to generate more Nobel Prize winners with that data out there, with us working together, with us learning faster than thinking about it from the individual perspective.
I'd like to add another example to support that. Under the NIH genomic data sharing policy, we expect all of our investigators to submit data into a repository called the Database of Genotypes and Phenotypes, or dbGaP. Right now, since 2007, there have been there's about 800 data sets currently in the repository. We've had close to 40,000 requests come in to access these data, and more than 1,500 publications that have resulted from the use of these data. And it's because the community wants to share that data and get it out there, and a lot of collaborations and everything have formed as a result.
This is just to reinforce those points. In sort of particular practice, my lab has shared data since I was a PI, and we do very large-scale data collection. It's called Project Implicit, a website where you can measure your implicit biases about different topics. And we make this data regularly available. And I've not won a Nobel Prize. I don't think anyone using our data has won one. But our careers have been advantaged, not disadvantaged by sharing data, because what has happened on multiple occasions is that someone else looking at our data set says, can we collaborate? We have this idea, you're the expert in that data, and we have this other thing that we want to do, and we've gained collaboration from that. Our data sets get cited a lot from it, and people think of us for other things, knowing that we do this kind of work and this kind of stuff. And so we've expanded both our citation rates and our collaborations as a function of openly sharing our data. And you can imagine the world where everyone's sharing the data, then everybody wins, right? It's getting access to data sets where they wouldn't have thought of that use that I have thought of. And that is, just makes it so much more efficient for everyone for discovery. The other part of the question that we haven't addressed yet was intellectual property. And I think that is a really important point about the open as the default, not the requirement. I think, and the SPARC, I think, does a great job of this, of open should be the default. There's always going to be reasons to not share something, but they should be the reasons. You should have to reason through, why can't we share this? Under what conditions? When can we share it? Rather than assuming that, nope, it's either open or nothing. That's not a pragmatic solution.
Nick, want to comment?
Yeah, I mean, related to the IP question, I'm not a lawyer, but standard disclaimer. As far as sort of patentability requirements, if you're going to share information in a scholarly publication that's going to be available through a subscription, whether it's openly licensed or not, I don't think should actually come to bear on changing whether something is patentable or not. And I know that's a concern that actually comes up quite often in meetings we do on Capitol Hill, pushing for federal public access legislation to codify the 2013 Holdren directive. But from speaking with lawyers, whether the final article has an open license or not, it's my understanding that it doesn't change the patentability.
Okay.
Excuse me. I actually have a follow-up on the IP question. I think the other side of the coin is a lot of public universities is looking at commercialization from IP as a funding source. So how do you then use commercialization aspects of certain in-house research, have open data sharing, have a patent on openly shared data, and then not lose out on commercialization, and then future research funds from it?
I'll start this one. So a lot of people have actually asked us and are quite surprised that we chose the CC BY license, which means we don't eliminate the use of commercial products. And so that was something we did very intentional. I mean, at the foundation, we do fund a lot of things that lead to commercial products. And I think it's important for us to realize that there's a lot of innovation in that space as well. As far as working with IP and patents and then making commercial products, I think it all has to be about timing. We get that question a lot as well, and I invite that before anything gets published, they do the proper patent applications or anything else around that before they openly make anything available. So I think it's going to be, having discussions about that process and maybe seeing if there's ways that it could be interlaced with openness more effectively.
Just one quick follow-up to that. Besides the publication often not being a challenge, as Nick mentioned, validation data usually isn't a challenge for commercial viability. So there's a range of things that can be made available even at the near term for commercialization interests. And then simultaneously, there's lots of opportunities for embargoing. Many of the data repository services will allow for an embargo period that would be one that's sufficient for providing confidence about commercialization or patenting interests, and yet still meet the goals of preservation of data and other research products.
To build on that just a little bit, Dryad's origin came out of a collaboration of about a dozen different journal editors in the field of mainly evolution and life sciences who came together and came up with a high-level policy of data sharing. They're going to require data as in a repository as a condition of publication. They wanted the data to be in some kind of repository, but they would allow embargoes of a certain kind. And so it was very high level, very basic, easy to communicate across a field. It was one particular field. And, you know, it was a culture change because at that time that was not a common thing. And what was really interesting in terms of the embargoes is that, you know, there were very similar concerns, maybe not as much on the commercial side, but very similar concerns about being scooped and so forth. And very, very few researchers actually took advantage of the embargo option. They were concerned about it, but when it came down, and it wasn't a hard option to request, you just had to sort of reason through it, you know, it just didn't really apply that often. It was that, you know, 0.5%, or whatever percent it was.
And I'll just say, in terms of university motivations, research funders are an irresistible force at the university because you just compare the numbers. My university is a top 10 in research funding. $1.4 billion a year was our last year number. We're also a top 10 in commercialization revenues, about $14 million. And just to make sure you could remember that. And so there's a lot of zeros between 1.4 billion and 14 million. And so if the research funders, not the federal necessarily, because your organization's big for us, they, you know, that if they want it, they're going to get it because the commercialization stuff is just, it's peanuts compared to the annual research.
Well, thank you for those questions. We got a lot of great feedback from our panel. We have one from the live stream that I'd like to throw on the table. And the question is, how should we deal with predatory open access journals?
Ooh, I love this question.
Jump in.
So my solution, number one, a lot of education around the process I think is really important, and I've worked on a couple projects kind of outside of my role on the foundation that are aimed to bring awareness of predatory journals, but it's still, I think, one of the biggest contributing factors is the need to publish and academic advancement, and the fact that it's a very westernized practice and tends to leave a lot of people just kind of out in the cold in publishing. And so one of the things I love most about Gates Open Research and the open peer review process is I think that's going to be extremely critical, that if we move towards a practice of open peer review, that we would see what these journals are like and what they're doing, and it would help us really be able to evaluate what is a predatory journal and what is not. Because I think, you know, especially with open access journals that are trying to start up automatically get labeled as predatory, so it's very hard to kind of establish any sort of credibility. And we've had, in the past couple of years, we have quite a few grantees that actually do publish in journals that I would label as predatory, and so I've taken that as an opportunity to educate them. I've actually successfully pulled some manuscripts back so that they could be published elsewhere, but these are a lot of early career researchers in the Global South who need to publish in order to finish their doctorate and move on in their career, and so they're really being stunted by not having that support. And we also hope with Gates Open Research that we can actually help them with any kind of language writing, editing, you know, how to get their thoughts across in such a way that would be picked up by a publication. But I think the Gates Open Research model and open peer review is going to be critical in kind of shining the light on these predatory practices.
I think that it's an important issue that the open access community has to make sure is, you know, dealt with and sort of prioritized. I think there are a number of community efforts around sort of stamping out predatory or low quality journals that have been really heartening. The Directory of Open Access Journals has introduced stricter sort of quality guidelines around what journals, you know, are allowed to be indexed by that particular service, and sort of look at the rigor of the peer review process of those journals that are asking to be listed in the DOAJ. There are other campaigns like Think, Check, Submit that are, you know, meant to try to educate authors about how to evaluate journals to make sure they don't accidentally end up publishing in one that doesn't have rigorous peer review. But as Ashley was as Ashley alluded to, I think a large part of the sort of problem of these predatory journals comes back to journal-based sort of rewards for researchers. If you look at the countries where there are a lot of researchers that are publishing in these low-quality journals, it's ones where researchers get direct sort of compensation, many times financial, from publishing in international journals, or other journal-based metrics. And I think sort of looking at how we evaluate researchers and the research they do, and focus more on impact, as we've already discussed, and less on publication venue, and sort of propagating those changes will help, really sort of drive down the demand by not having this sort of reward system that sort of incentivizes people to publish even in questionable places.
Anybody else on the predators? Maybe just a follow-up on the reward or award. A question, particularly from a professional society standpoint, where we provide a lot of recognition for achievement in our field. We don't really recognize those who are, publishing open. Should there is that an area that needs to be addressed to make this cultural change that we've talked about?
I can take that a little bit. I mean, I'm sure a lot of us have a couple of different ideas. I don't come from academia, but I come from society management, and so there are different ways you can, I think, address and raise the visibility of people who are doing the things that your society or your community values, and open is one of those that ECS is committed to. In the studies that you see about membership in organizations, one of the things that encourages long-term membership is an engagement, kind of an engagement score. People talk about this engagement metric. And oftentimes you think of engagement in terms of giving back, and that's very much what it is. If you're able to participate in a society or a community and be an expert or help somebody else on some topic, not only does it make you feel productive and helpful and has some, nice sides to that, but it also can propel you to, being more of an expert, help you find more collaborations and so forth. So being able to recognize people who are doing some of these things as an ambassador to the society, a particular kind of fellow of the society, or different things like that could be very valuable, I think, as a way to recognize people doing things that are aligned with the society or a community's goals.
Mm-hmm.
It was the reason this question is why I brought up that the SIGGRAPH conference votes in their top people for the dream team. It's just another way to recognize a different dimension of their contribution, not from a particular thing. And I think our community recognizes recognition by peers, above and beyond all things. And so as you think about ways to recognize peers, you just have to say what message you're communicating and have it accepted as a meaningful thing for the community.
If I can add one thing to this topic, this might seem a little tangential, but I'll hopefully get back around to tying this in. There's one of the most interesting sort of structures for an institutional open access policy bakes it directly into the institution's promotion and tenure process. So at the university in Belgium as one of the strongest institutional open access policies. And the reason it's so strong is that in order for any published research to be eligible for your promotion and tenure, for your evaluation, in the forms that you submit, the form actually only accepts links from their institutional repository. So you can't submit a link to the publisher's version of the paper. You can only submit a link from the institutional repository. So it just sort of bakes in sort of depositing into the institutional repository into the process of getting promotion and tenure. And so I mention this because I think it's a really clever way to sort of elegantly weave open into these larger structures. And so, in talking about what you do here at ECS, what that might look like is, if you want to submit your paper for consideration to be presented, you need to be linking from, some type of repository. It needs to be accessible in some way. But thinking about how you can sort of elegantly weave in sort of public or open accessibility into you know, these structures that you've already built.
Yes, good. I see we have a question from the audience.
Yeah, so this is kind of a follow-up to something Ashley mentioned in the previous question, and that's the idea of open peer review. So I guess in kind of a dystopian way, I imagine this could devolve into like a YouTube comment section where we don't get a lot of valuable feedback or something like that, and that's kind of not the direction that I want to, you know, kind of sort this question towards. But what can we as members of academic societies and as scholars do to foster a community of positive open peer review?
Yeah, I think people are surprised at the efforts that have been made so far to open peer review, that it's actually been quite successful. There was was it in Nature recently? That was, I think just this week it was published. They did a study of offering, is it a double-blind peer review and then just a standard peer review of their authors, and it had so little uptake that actually most times people wanted it to be open and they wanted to sign their name to it. So there really wasn't any really interest there or support for kind of a double-blind peer review. And I think we've seen in cases where there is open peer review, you could check out all the articles on Welcome Open Research. They've been doing this for the past year. And its ability to give people credit, number one, for the time and effort of putting into these reviews, and then letting the community really draw from that. F1000's technology allows, each one is citable, so there's actually kind of a merit and credit to what previously has been hidden away. Like, the only people really seeing it is the author. So, and I think it could cut down on actually a lot of the sort of bullying that can happen sometimes too, when people aren't, you know, if you have that kind of cloak of being anonymous, you can kind of say whatever you want to say if you're not putting your name on it. And this way, people have to be confident in their critiquing ability. And I think it will guide open peer review to be more of a conversation and a way to really strengthen the research than more of a critique of whether or not this is bad or good science, or whether it has the novelty of being published. Because so much of peer review is often, you know, I think looks at these publications as the end-all be-all for that experiment or that topic, and that's not the case. This is a snapshot in building up to a bigger picture. The current state of the OA that I shared was a preprint that, this is the first time I've had the experience of trying to publish an article and seeing some of the feedback. It's like, it's great, but it's also, you know, you're trying to convey that we're building towards a bigger result, you know, it's just one piece of the puzzle, and I think the more that we kind of just collaborate and converse, it'll be better overall.
Any others? Maybe it's not such a bad idea to create a YouTube phenomena. So let me throw Sci-Hub on the table. Any thoughts about Sci-Hub?
Sure. Is everybody familiar with Sci-Hub, first of all? So, Sci-Hub is essentially like a file sharing website for academic research articles. A very large proportion of which are infringing copies of articles. They're the final publisher copies, you know, posted and sort of shared largely illegally. The creator of Sci-Hub is being sued currently by, I think, Elsevier and maybe a handful of other commercial entities for essentially creating this database. I think it has more than 500 million research articles, a good portion of all the published research literature that's accessible. So that's what Sci-Hub is. Another description I think fairly you could sort of make of Sci-Hub is that, at least for me, it's a perfect sort of symptom of how broken the system of scholarly communications is. You know, I often see people talk about it as sort of the solution to the problem, but I think it's more of a symptom than the solution. And that's, you know, to me, Sci-Hub is a very vivid example of how how far our technological capacity for distributing science and research has gotten past our business models, right? You know, a 20-something PhD student has essentially created a platform that in many ways is more efficient at distributing research articles than legacy structures. It's not a sustainable model, but it is for people that can't pay thousands of dollars for an academic research journal subscription. It's the only way that they're getting access to research, and we need to update our models to better serve those individuals and take action like ECSs with Free the Science to switch to a new model so that we don't have to, so that researchers aren't sort of forced to go to Sci-Hub or use, other alternative means, right? There are similar actions that researchers have been taking for, decades trying to get around the system, right? It's emailing the author because your university doesn't have a subscription. Or my personal favorite, if any of you have seen the hashtag #ICANHasPDF, where people will tweet, asking for people to send them copies of articles that they don't have. And actually, I take that back. My favorite example is there's an email listserv for public policy fellows that's maintained by a very, very visible society that I won't name, but they have public policy fellows that come here to DC. They leave their institutions, so they don't have access to their journals through their institutions anymore, but they're trying to drive US science policy. I've seen emails go around on this society's email form asking for people to essentially legally send them PDFs of articles using the society's email infrastructure. But these are just sort of the ways that we've gotten used to getting around these paywalls. And I think Sci-Hub is the probably most vivid and latest illustration of how that's happening. But to me, it just sort of emphasizes the urgency with which we need to sort of tackle the business models and make an open system that is sustainable.
Yeah, to build on that just a little bit, John Bohannon came out with an article in Science last year, and I am not able to remember the title of it, about Sci-Hub, and he did a study on sort of where people are and who is downloading these papers. And we were very pleased at Dryad to host this data set. It's one of our most popular data sets because he published it and said, okay, now go get the data and you come up with something. And they're not all coming from, and the majority are not coming from areas that don't have access. Many of them are coming from within a university. Whether or not they have access to that particular journal they're accessing, I do not know. But I think a lot of it is the friction in the process. They could go to their library and access the journal one way. In their office on campus, they might access it slightly different. But if they're working at home, there's just different frictions depending on where you are in various logins and things. And it's a real learning curve, I think, to for the way we're disseminating research, to realize that, you really have to address these frictions, either in business model or in, a ridiculous amount of logins and passwords and so forth.
Yes, I actually want to understand that a little bit better. And the reason I called Sci-Hub a potential phenomena is because when you go to their website, you'll see they bill themselves as a pirate, bragging about the 68 million articles that they've stolen for, so that the community can access these, because it's wrong that they can't. And I've seen some of their data. I believe it was, wherever I saw it, that just as to follow up what you were saying is that the researchers that were accessing it, this isn't the global south. These were from parts of the world that you would expect they would have the money. And so is your data telling you that they are knowingly going and accessing research that's been stolen and just because they can?
Yeah, I think so. I think you see some of these models in music or in other, copyrighted intellectual property where for some reason a consumer will decide, maybe they own their album at home, but they just want to get it online, so they're just going to go to YouTube and download that. They already bought the album, so it seems like it feels okay to them. There are models for sort of people, acting this way. And it's interesting because, the challenges around why is Sci-Hub there, why is it popular, I think it is giving us an opportunity in a sense. It's easy for me to say because I'm not a publisher, because it's not threatening sort of my livelihood directly, but it's a good opportunity to look inward and evaluate sort of the way we're delivering information and what are all the hoops and the requirements that we're putting in front of researchers when they're trying to get the questions that they have answered.
We're getting near to the end. Oh, we have a question, please.
Yeah, just one more. I think you touched on this with patents and everything, but how is industry relating to open access, are they really on board with this? I haven't heard too much about industry, mostly just academia. Are they open to publishing their results? I think you mentioned they would do a patent first and then they would let the data out. Do we get much support from industry?
I mean, when it comes to open access, we're talking about, work that's going to be published in some form or another. It's going to be made accessible. It's just whether it's, you have to pay for a subscription or it's openly licensed. So we haven't gotten, at least from SPARC's perspective and pushing for, open access to the research literature, we haven't gotten pushback from sort of commercial entities broadly. I mean, the pushback's really from a handful of commercial publishers and, some scholarly societies as well that depend on journal income. But we've, heard lots of positive things from industry about, how much they have to spend on getting access to the research literature. And particularly, if you're thinking about startups or smaller businesses, I think one of the most compelling arguments for open, and one that we make on Capitol Hill all the time, is that, if you want research to have an economic impact, you really need to make sure that it's open and not locked behind, paywalls where, there aren't startups, they're not going to be paying millions of dollars for academic journal subscriptions. That's just not, feasible. So if we want to sort of supercharge that area of the economy, one step is making sure the research literature is available. So sort of to get to your question, I think a lot of the feedback that we've heard from commercial industries is positive on sort of lowering their costs in accessing the research literature and not so much concern about making the findings openly available because they're going to be, they're going to be available in some form. It's just whether it's behind a subscription or open with an open license.
To extend that a little bit into open data and open workflows, this is an area that's a little bit humbling for academic researchers, at least in my neck of the woods. It tends to be industry and sniffs industry. They're terrible. And yet, industry has much better practices internally for managing data, for managing workflow, for documenting what they're doing for their own internal purposes. And so it's actually a lot easier in many industries to transition that to more openly shareable data and workflows than it is for academic labs that are all over the place with how they manage and maintain their own data sets. And so at least in pharma, there's actually been, except on the conditions of patents and competitive advantage, occasions for validation evidence or otherwise, a lot more it's like, that's not a big deal. We can make that available relatively easily compared to what academic labs will say.
And from the foundation's perspective, I think we're now, so we've kind of, we've got the open access under control. And now that as we start thinking about open science and what that looks like and what that looks like for our grant funding and research outputs, we're starting to interact more with industry members. Actually, at the end of this week, we have an open science convening where we've invited some industry folks to come in and discuss what open science means to them. So hopefully we'll be able to share some of that happenings.
That would be valuable. I think that was a terrific question because from our own limited experience, we tried to get industry perspective in this session, and as you can see, we failed to get that perspective. We don't have an industry representative.
So another issue or important aspect of those kind of public-private partnerships and people collaborating together are the use of, data use agreements and kind of stating up front what the expectations are for everyone, who's involved, and understanding that, different repositories or resources may have their own licensing or legal issues, and it's just important for everybody to know up front what's involved and what they'll be able to do.
Any other questions from the audience? Well, we get the last question. So I'd like to ask any of the panelists who want to weigh in. As ECS is really running with the ball on open science and open access, can you give our community any advice on how to make this transition to a more open future to help support ECS on its mission to free the science?
All right. I would say that my piece of advice would be to figure out what your goals and convictions are and then stick with them to the very bitter end. That's, I think, what was most successful in our
Ouch.
whole policy was that there was no exceptions and we are sticking with it and it's made change. So until you reach the science is fully free, just keep going.
Appreciate that. You're right, it takes that kind of conviction.
Building on that.
No more.
I mean, one of the things that I really do appreciate about what ECS is doing is that I think in a way that's more intentional than most organizations, you're looking at how your actions actually reflect the values that you talk about, right? The academic publications, the knowledge that academic societies produce, is one of your most valuable, if not the most valuable, work that you as a society do. How much sense does it make for that really important thing to be locked behind a paywall where 99+% of people can't get access to it? And I really applaud the Electrical Chemical Society for deliberately thinking through, whether sort of how you're distributing all of the knowledge that your members work to create actually reflects your values. And I think it's fantastic to see sort of this Free the Science campaign, in action to make that transition. And I think it's something that a lot of organizations, I hope, will sort of look at your work here and sort of make this similar determination. And I think, if we could do that, it would change so many of these different things that we've talked about, right? It's difficult often for researchers to be open because the reward system are fundamentally out of line with what the mission statement of the university is or what the mission statement of a research funder is. And so Gates is starting to take steps to realign that. So as the NIH and other funders, I hope that institutions, universities, in addition to scholarly societies, will look at whether their P&T policies actually align with the mission of the university. And if not, to to start making changes in how researchers are evaluated so that you feel more free to be open, that you get credit in a meaningful way for the work it takes to make your data, your articles openly available, and sort of the benefits that accrue when people actually build on your work and cite it.
I'm going to go back to what I said at the beginning, which was to make known to the community what resources, policies, and requirements are out there so that the community kind of knows what they're supposed to do or where to turn if they need help, and maybe even provide some use cases for successful openness in other scientific communities.
I would just say, go out to your divisions, ask them what are the research products that can move your field forward faster, and start creating authentic, reviewed products that help the field move forward faster, and they'll get recognized for that. Success will beget success. But think products, not just publications.
I believe that policy is really one of the most meaningful ways to actually move the needle forward in terms of sharing more data or making things more open. And to develop policy, which you've already started on, I would just encourage you to continue to engage your community, but also especially engaging your critics within your community. The policies that I've seen that have become the most successful and the quickest are the ones that were developed with the largest critics against them in that society or in that editorial board together. And oftentimes the output at the end is a very good high-level policy without too many compromises that give up the actual goals of the design. So I would just encourage you to not be afraid of engaging your critics when you're developing these kind of policies.
They all said really good stuff. The only additional thing is start today. You can engage in open peer review online. There's lots of great sites doing it. You can sign up for the OSF and start managing your projects. ECS Archive is coming out sometime soon. You can start posting preprints there. Just start.
Well, thank you. That was fantastic, and we really appreciate all your comments. And now I'd like to invite our president, John Aletti, back up for some final words.
Well, that was very enlightening. Thank you, Roque. I'd like to thank the panelists for their fine job and attention to all the questions and excellent answers. And I would like to thank the audience and those here and also online for tuning in. And so the more voices in support of open science and open access, the greater the driving force for change. So think about it. And I would invite you all to join us for the ECS opening reception in the Cherry Blossom Ballroom soon. Thank you.